Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about how culture spreads, and we'll be looking at a concept called a cultural hearth. We've talked about it before in our globalization section of this course, but today we're going to take a deeper look because we're talking about the ways that culture might spread from one central location to nearby locations and then ultimately globally. So it's an interesting topic. I hope you enjoy it and follow along. So, what is a cultural hearth? So, a cultural hearth is the starting point or origin of a social system that produces and reinforces elements of a culture. Diffusion is the process where cultural elements like artifacts, sociofacts, and minifacts spread outward from that central location or starting point. So, basically, when we talk about diffusion of culture, we're just talking about it spreading. We're talking about culture beginning in one place and spreading to other locations. And in our case, we're talking about the spread of culture globally. On your screen, you see a list of some of the cultural hearths around the globe. These are places where we can trace back a particular form of culture or a particular sort of starting point for a culture that has since kind of spread more broadly or even globally. So take a look. You have Mesopotamia, which we talked about in our globalization section in this course. Today, that would make up the countries of Iraq, Syria, Turkey. And from there, we can see some key cultural innovations that have spread. The writing systems, urban planning systems. That means kind of the planning of cities and the ways that cities function, the domestication of cattle, and so forth. Then next on the list is the Nile River Valley, where Egypt is located. We can look at hieroglyphics. We can look at complex religious systems, architecture, advanced irrigation processes. So these are all cultural innovations that then spread in that region and then ultimately globally. In the Indus River Valley, we have where today India and Pakistan are located. You have planned urbanization or planned cities, sophisticated sewage and water systems, and then, of course, we have early forms of social stratification, or what we might call the caste system. So you have a sort of a division of the social order and higher classes, lower classes, and so forth. We have the Weihuang Valley, or the Yellow River Valley in China, and this is where we find influence of innovative tools and weapons, a writing system, hydraulic engineering, and then some of China's earliest dynasties located in that region. When I lived in China, I lived in a city called Zhengzhou, which is one of the ancient capitals, was one of the ancient capitals of China. And it is in this Yellow River Valley area, which is often in China called the cradle of Chinese civilization. Then we have Mesoamerica, so Mexico, Central America. Here we see domestication of a lot of the crops that we depend on nowadays, like corn and beans. We have a calendar system that's innovated there, the concept of zero from the Mayan people. Concept of zero, very interesting in mathematics. It does seem to today, to modern people, that the concept of zero seems obvious, or I guess just something we're highly familiar with and we use every day. But it really was quite a mathematic innovation for the Mayan people. We have in West Africa, from Senegal to Nigeria, we have evidence of early ironworking there, complex social and political organizations, trade networks that were established there. And then in the Andean American, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, we have more advanced agricultural practices like terrace farming, domestication of some crops like potatoes, and a complex road system. So you can see, these are just a few examples, but you can see if you look back, and archaeologists and anthropologists can look back and see the roots of some of these early cultural hearths that then gave birth to cultures that spread regionally, and then across continentally, and then globally. And so it's interesting to look at them today and see how the impact of those cultural hearths can still be felt. One interesting aspect to look at with these cultural hearths is to take a look at the religious impact. A couple of key religious hearths that we can look back on are the Levant, a region in the Middle East and West Asia, where we can find the roots of what we might call the Abraham religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which makes up a massive portion of the global population today. People who thousands of years after these religions were first established are still adherents to those religions, literally in the billions of people population-wise. And then in the Indus River Valley, or the Ganges River Valley, we have the birthplaces of Hinduism and Buddhism. Again, also really monumentally influential religions that today still have millions and even billions of adherents around the world. It's interesting to think about what we might call our modern hearths, our cultural touch points, the places around the globe that today have a really large influence on the rest of society. I think if you look around the world, we will immediately think of New York City, which is a finance capital, a lot of fashion, art, birthplace of hip hop, or one of the birthplaces of hip hop. And then you have Los Angeles and Hollywood, where you have the global film industry, television, lots of pop culture coming out of that area. London, right? It's an international finance hub, lots of fashion, of course, music that has been influential there for decades with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Tokyo in Japan, it's a massive technological hub. It, with anime, video games, comic books, youth fashion, all of that are things that we can look at from Tokyo. Silicon Valley, technology, software design, social media. Think about the impact of social media in just the last couple of decades, and how that all sort of was born out of this Silicon Valley region of the USA and California. And then with Mumbai, we have Bollywood, huge impact on South Asian culture. And so these are modern hearths. These are places where culture is sort of born and then it diffuses, it moves outward into other regions. So if you live somewhere like Joplin, Missouri, where I'm currently working, teaching on the campus of Missouri Southern, this is, we often feel sort of culture as sort of a wave that comes in and hits us, maybe sometimes long after that culture is first born in one of these cultural hearths. Now, the internet has changed this quite a bit, right? We're no longer waiting for culture to make its way to us over maybe months and years. Now it's more instantaneous. We can get information right away. You can look up the local, or you can look up the most recent fashion trends. You can watch the most recent films, listen to the most recent music. The internet has given us instant access to cultures from all around the world. So it might be argued that these cultural hearths today, the modern cultural hearths, might not play as significant of a role in the spreading of culture as they once did. Now, there's still hubs, right? These are still places around the globe where lots of culture is sort of born, but we're no longer dependent on those hubs. Any kid in America or anywhere around the world can start a YouTube channel and become quite influential, and they don't need to be in one of these major cities in order to be influential or to make an impact. And so the internet has certainly democratized cultural diffusion in a way that I think probably has not been seen before, but it's an interesting thing to consider about how it will look in the future, and in what ways will the emergence of AI and other technologies impact the spread of culture and the diffusion of cultural aspects. So now that we've talked a bit about where culture is born from and then it spreads from, we can think about the starting point, but how does it spread? And it's kind of interesting. There's these three different types of cultural diffusion that we're going to look at. The first type that we would look at, we might call contagious diffusion. So we all know what contagious means, right? And most of the time we want to stay away from people who are contagious. But culture can be contagious. And when we see cultural diffusion in a contagious diffusion, we're looking at it, aspects of culture that spread really, really rapidly from direct contact and interpersonal influence. So this is kind of person to person, right? It's one person embracing an aspect of culture and passing that on to another. If you think about a new song, a new hit song, one person hears it on the radio. They then play that song for their friend. That friend loves the song, so they play it for another friend, and so on. So this is where we get this idea of contagion. It's also similar, a good example of this might be a slang term. Like a lot of people are using slang terms recently. I've caught myself saying things like 6'7" or whatever, that I'm like not really sure where it came from. I don't know the full context of it. I don't really understand it, but I've heard enough people say it, and it became somewhat contagious to where you see it everywhere. And most of you are probably sick of it, and by the time you listen to this lecture, you're probably like, yeah, nobody says that anymore. That's fine. It's just an example of that contagion aspect, the way that things spread rapidly. And then kind of like a disease, maybe at some point, because we've heard it so much or we've been exposed to these cultural contagious elements so often that we almost work up a bit of our immune system. We have a defense against it, and pretty soon we're just like, yeah, that's not cool anymore, and we're not interested in it. So it can burn itself out, kind of like a virus. The next type of diffusion I want to talk about is relocation diffusion. So this is when a group of people migrate from one area to another. So they have one particular culture from the starting point. They move to a new region, and then they spread that new culture with the people that they have now moved in close to, their new neighbors. This is a culture that spreads when people migrate and take their cultural elements with them. Immigrants, for example, bring their own traditional cuisines, their own fashion styles, their own values and priorities, their own languages, right? And all of this might impact the communities where they live. And so a family from China moving into a small rural community in the middle of Missouri or Kansas, is going to have some impact on the people there. Maybe they open up a Chinese restaurant, or they have a particular presence in on the local school board, or whatever it might be. But their culture is going to impact those around them. So this is relocation diffusion. Another type of diffusion is hierarchical diffusion. And this spreads when a larger or more influential, more powerful, maybe more richer culture starts to influence smaller or less influential cultures, right? So you might have a mainstream culture like Western American culture, and it in some way sort of imposes itself upon those smaller, less influential, less powerful cultures. So this is very top down. It's a kind of a power dynamic where one culture starts to overwhelm or sort of outpace the others. One way to think of this is, for example, in the world of fashion, a lot of fashion trends start in Europe, in Paris, or Tokyo, or New York, or Milan, and they kind of set the tone for what good fashion is. And those of us who live out here in the more rural areas of the country and the world, we catch up with it eventually, and the rules that they've established about what looks good, what looks cool, are eventually sort of imposed on us. I don't get to influence really anyone in New York about how they dress. But sure enough, like someone in New York who's involved in the fashion world, who maybe is a clothing designer or, you know, some kind of a hairstylist or whatever, they might create fashion trends that ultimately I will have to live with. I'll eventually be told that that shirt that I love is no longer cool, and I have to buy something that has been deemed cool by some fashionista somewhere in one of these large cultural hearths in Tokyo or in New York or wherever. So anyway, so this is hierarchical diffusion. It's the idea that the powerful kind of force their culture upon those of us who maybe don't have as much influence or power. This isn't always intentional, by the way. Like oftentimes, that influence is unintended, and a lot of times, whenever you have a dominant culture, people will gravitate towards it willingly and voluntarily. So it might be that if I choose to embrace some of the fashion choices from New York, that's my own decision, right? I'm not necessarily being forced to dress in a certain way, but because I want to fit in, I want to be part of the mainstream, then I might adjust the way I dress and the clothes I wear accordingly so that I can fit in, right? So it's not always that it's being forced upon me. Sometimes if we embrace new culture, we're willingly embracing it and accepting it into our lives. One division that we could look at here with culture is to think about culture in terms of pop culture versus folk culture. And it's interesting and important to separate these two because I think that they have some real clear distinctions that can help us to think about how culture is diffused. Oftentimes, folk culture that doesn't make its way into the mainstream doesn't spread as quickly as pop culture, right? Pop culture is, by definition, sort of cultural aspects that are very popular. They spread wide and far and quickly. And so let's look at a couple of the differences here. So on your screen, you see a chart here that kind of lays out some of the differences between folk culture and popular culture. So in origin, we can see that with folk culture, sometimes the origin is a little bit unclear or anonymous. So if there's a particular type of music, maybe a particular instrumentation, a kind of clothing style, a lot of times with folk culture, we don't know where these things came from. They trace back further than maybe our history can tell us. And so folk culture often has this sort of a sense of a sort of kind of being manifested out of nothing, right? And a lot of times there's mythology tied into folk culture because we don't know the origins always, right? Pop culture is different because we do typically know the origins. We know who the creators are. We have a specific starting point. We know where this cultural artifact was created, or we know where this particular music might come from, or this painting came from. And so those types of pop culture elements we can look at and we understand their origin. The transmission of folk culture works differently than the transmission of pop culture as well. So folk culture is primarily diffused or transferred through contagious or relocation diffusion. That means it's either one-on-one sort of spread, like a contagion, or it's a relocation where people who have certain folk practices that are part of their own culture. They move, they bring that culture to another location where they expose others to it. So, whereas with pop culture, we see it diffuses more often through hierarchy, through power, through one culture that is dominant, sort of in some ways, whether intentionally or not, imposing these smaller, less influential cultures with their music, right? So this is like the spread of American pop music, right? We can play our songs all around the globe. If you go to pretty much any country in the world and turn on the radio and flip through the stations, you're going to come across some American music. And that's just not true of music from Paraguay or from Mexico even, right? I mean, maybe Mexico's a bad example here in the U.S., but I don't think if you're in the middle of Africa somewhere that you're going to come across a Mexican radio station. You could come across a radio station playing American music, right? So this is sort of the hierarchy of cultures. When you have a powerful, influential country like the U.S., then our pop culture spreads through that means. Distribution, there are differences with folk culture. Usually distribution is very local. It spreads through families, associations, through churches, through community organizations, and so forth. Whereas pop culture is spread nowadays more digitally via the internet. It's rapid, and it's broadly spread, right? And then finally, the purpose of a lot of folk culture is to, rooted in the local environment, rooted in local resources. So if we're talking about like folk customs and clothing, we're using materials that are grown locally, that can be found locally to make that clothing or that cuisine and so forth. And a lot of times folk culture is focused on sustainability because a lot of folk culture is born out of places that are impoverished or at least are not fully developed economies, and so a lot of the cultural elements that are developed are things that are sustainably grown in those places or are sourced in those locations. So anyway, then on the pop culture side, we see that the purpose of pop culture a lot of times is to generate revenue, right? So we're looking at pop culture as a product a lot of cases, and the people who create it, their intention is to make a profit, to get rich. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. Doesn't mean that pop culture is not valuable, or that it's not worthwhile. It just means that there are different purposes. Folk culture usually has a way of serving a community and uniting a community, whereas pop culture often is used as a product to generate revenue. So obviously pop culture has some advantages over folk culture. For one, in a globalized world, pop culture is favored because it's standardized and it's homogenized. It's easier for a large group of people who come from different backgrounds, who might speak different languages. They can engage with a lot of pop culture and find it acceptable, find it even enjoyable, and that's because of that standardization, the homogenization of these cultural artifacts. Pop culture is also really easily distributed. As I mentioned in the previous slide, a lot of pop culture can be digitized now so that it can be shared instantly on platforms across the internet. So we can watch videos on YouTube, we can engage on social media and so forth. And then also with pop culture, we have economies of scale. So there's an advantage in producing things at a mass level, printing off, billions of Taylor Swift t-shirts, for example, or spreading digital files of certain pop songs across the globe so that they can be played on radio stations and be posted on YouTube channels and things like that. So there's a lot of advantages that go in the favor of pop culture and allow it to spread very quickly. On the opposite side of that coin, of course, is the threat to folk culture. So because of globalization, we see folk culture being sort of pushed to the wayside because folk culture so often is dependent upon a very localized, contextualized resource. So often it only is enjoyable or appreciated by a small segment of the population, maybe in one local region. So it doesn't package as well to be spread globally. And because it's local, because it's folk cultures are usually not digitized, but more material based or sort of older styles of creative activity. Like then you have an inability for those folk cultures to compete with the pop culture products that are being created by record labels and of course Hollywood film production and so on. So it's very hard for folk culture to compete with pop culture in this realm because they just don't have the same tools and they speak to a smaller audience. Most of us, if we can't understand the language of a particular folk music, then we're not going to engage with it. If we can't source the ingredients for a particular folk cuisine, then we're not going to probably spend time learning about that cuisine and cooking. If we don't speak the language, we're not going to engage with the written artifacts of that culture. So for a lot of reasons, it's just very hard for folk cultures to sustain themselves, particularly in this kind of globalized world we live in. So I have a few questions I'd like you to ponder and think about, and we may discuss these in a discussion forum on online, or we may find other ways to incorporate these questions later on. But I wanted you just to think about them. So the first question here is, can one trend, like a new food or style, spread in all the three ways that we talked about? Contagious, as in person to person, relocation by moving people, or hierarchy from big places to small places. So think about it. Can a trend, which is a popular aspect of culture, can it be spread in those three ways? And if so, what does that look like? And maybe you can think of some examples of cultural trends of one sort or another that have spread that way. Another thing to think about. Think of a trend that became popular quickly, but then completely disappeared. Why wasn't it sticky, or why didn't it last? Can you think of an example of something that became popular very quickly, you saw it everywhere, and then suddenly it just kind of disappeared? Why do you think so? Why do you think that happened? Next one, since global popular culture is taking over, what happens to small local folk cultures? Should governments or international groups try to save them? Why or why not? What do you think? Is it worth working hard to preserve cultures like folk cultures that may die out within the next generation or so if left to their own devices? Here in the Ozarks, we have a lot of folk culture, and there are people that try their best to preserve it. But is it worth it for the government to step in and try to intervene, to try to preserve these local cultures in some way or another? And touching on something that we discussed just a few minutes ago, we learned that trends usually start in big cities and then spread outward. These are called cultural hearths. Does the internet and social media, where anyone can make anything go viral, still let big cities control what's popular? How has this changed the hierarchical diffusion of culture? Do you think that big cities still have a role to play in creating and spreading culture? Thank you for your time. I'll see you in the next video.